And thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ today. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have some incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of different speakers. We've had historians, authors, elected officials, journalists. Next Friday, oh shoot, I forgot to write down who's coming next Friday. Okay, next Friday is Jared Keenan with ACLU as part of our continuing series that we're doing about our criminal justice system here in Arizona. So I'm looking forward to that and the other things coming up. We also have all of these different home tours and street fairs and things like that. This weekend we'll be at the Coronado Street Fair, and the following weekend, no rest for the wicked. The following weekend we're going to be at the Melrose Street Fair, as well as the Tucson Festival of Books, which I just found out Linda Ronstadt and Bernie Sanders are going to be there signing copies of their books. So should be a good time. But for today, I'm really excited because we are speaking to a local journalist who's done some of the most incredible investigative journalism truly that I've ever seen. Jimmy Jenkins is a criminal justice reporter focusing on prisons, jails, police, and courts. He's done some great work as well with regards to executions in the state of Arizona. He's written for the Arizona Republic, NPR, the Marshall Project, USA Today, and more. He grew up in a small town in Indiana near a large state prison with a father who was in law enforcement, all of which sparked an internet in criminology and criminal justice. Near the end of his degree program, he realized he really didn't understand the system, so he decided to pursue a career that would allow him to continue investigating it, always from a position of empathy and compassion. And boy, can we use more empathy and compassion in today's world. So welcome, Jimmy. Is there anything that I missed in your bio?
No, that's very kind. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can kind of kick off from there. That's a good starting point. If I could just kind of let everyone know, where I'm coming from. Yeah, so like you said, I am from the Midwest. I'm from a small town in Indiana called Terre Haute. And when I was a younger person in high school getting ready to go into college, unfortunately, because of the location of my hometown, which is actually, there was a study once done, and Terre Haute is the one city in America that is closest to the largest number of large metro areas in America. And because of that, it's kind of a central distribution point for drugs and drug trafficking. And so when I was about 18, that geographic factor, as well as the fact that we're a rural community, which has a lot of farmland and a lot of people who use anhydrous ammonia in their farming, led to a real methamphetamine epidemic. And so what that meant was people discovered how to manufacture a very powerful drug, methamphetamine, very cheaply. And at the same time, the opioid pandemic kind of started to hit, where epidemic started to hit. So where not only were we struggling with the meth, but pain pills started to show up. All these drugs are being trafficked through my hometown. So, my friends, my loved ones, people who were pillars of the community, they started becoming involved in the criminal justice system. You'd see them in the news and the paper. They're getting arrested, taken to jail, some of them even going to prison. And as was said in the intro, my father was in law enforcement. He was a county sheriff deputy, and then he was the county sheriff. And so I was brought up from a very different, perspective. While my dad did and my mom taught me, love and empathy and to respect others, I certainly had some thoughts about the criminal justice system. I thought, I knew who was in jail, who went to prison. It was just, so-called bad people who committed violent crimes, and they were there for a good reason. And I pretty much, I trusted the criminal justice system. But when I started seeing my friends and loved ones and people in the community becoming involved with the criminal justice system, that was the first time in my life for me where it kind of started me on this journey of, what is really going on. I thought that only the bad guys went to prison. And, why is like this local council person who I trust, why is the person who coached my baseball team, why is he going to prison for drugs? What is this all about? So started pretty young for me because unfortunately, that was just the first time when I was faced with these things. And so, yes, I went to college. I studied the criminal justice system. I got a degree in criminology. But again, at the same time, while I was doing ride-alongs, while I was monitoring the court system, while I was interning with public defenders, I just couldn't help but see all the deficiencies. You know, I for the first time in my life, I think I was in my early 20s when you'd see that cattle call of people come into the courtroom and, you know, they're all lined up, they're all shackled together and nobody really getting a moment for their justice. It was just kind of like I was interning with the public defender's office. And even though while those are really good, well-intentioned people, I'd see them go up to them and basically say, you know, here's the plea that you're going to take. Here's the time that you're going to do. We're not going to argue for your defense really at all. We're just going to send you to prison. So all these things added to a lot of internal confusion for me. It didn't really jive with what I've been taught about the criminal justice system. And so I started to focus on the criminal justice system with my writing. I then went back to grad school and got my grad degree in journalism. And in Indiana at the time, they were recodifying the criminal code. So they were taking all the laws and kind of deciding, you know, should we make things should we give them harsher punishments? Should we reduce them? Should we add new laws to punish people? And so that was really eye-opening. In Indiana, unlike Arizona, I had a lot of access to prisons. I was able to tour several state and the federal penitentiary there, met with a lot of people in the women's prison there. That was my first exposure to women in prison and the high increasing number of women that we incarcerate in prison. And touring the women's prison there was really what set me on a path to just be more interested in the way we incarcerate women and the increasing number of women that we incarcerate in this country. So then moving to Arizona, I took a job at the local NPR station, KJZZ. Hope everybody out there is a listener and a member. And they allowed me to focus on similar issues. And while I was at KJZZ, I discovered, or, you know, I started reading about this ongoing Arizona prison healthcare trial. And so I asked my editors, I said, hey, can I go start monitoring this and reporting on it? And it was a good thing for me to kind of, you know, get my feet wet, get into the system, because for 2 or 3 days a month, every month, magistrate judge David Duncan would have all the parties in and they'd have a status conference and they'd say, you know, how are we doing? What's going on? Are you meeting the court-ordered benchmarks that we set? You know, why am I still hearing of people not getting their insulin? Why are women still begging and writing the court for, you know, pads and tampons? You know, what is the problem here? And so I monitored that for several years. Judge Duncan actually retired in 2018 for health reasons. The case moved on to Judge Rosalind Silver. She got fed up with the whole business and threw it back into a trial that took place last year. The trial lasted for 4 weeks. We were there for wall-to-wall coverage. And then, you know, finally the result of that trial was increased. Basically, it's going to be harder, you know, higher benchmarks, and they're going to hold the state to a higher standard. And with the looming threat of perhaps taking the prison healthcare system into receivership. And so that, following that case was kind of my entry point to Arizona prisons in general. And that's how we got to the point where I found out about, for several years, one of the things that I just always heard was that women were being forced to have their babies when the prison wanted them to. And, you know, I'd always heard this. It was kind of like a rumor that I could never really confirm. People who gotten out had told me, oh yeah, I mean, it's just kind of sad when you think about it, that for a lot of these women, that grievance was kind of like 3 or 4 down the list as far as like things that they thought I should be paying attention to. You know, they'd say like, well, you know, that was bad, but I really want you to pay attention to this, this, and this. So it's kind of a combination of those factors. And then finally, there's a person inside who is a, you know, really good coordinator of information, who was able to get back out to me the names of 3, 4, 5 different people, more like 6. We ended up publishing 3 who had these same experiences where they were forced to induce their labor against their will. And, you know, they went on the record, they talked about it, and we published their story. And so I can share that with you right now.
I'm just going to say, since there's a bit of a break, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. And if you're on Facebook, you can put them on there. That's
okay. Yeah. And you can Google this or we can put the link in the chat. But if you just Google Arizona labor prisoners, something like that. But this story had more impact, greater reach than anything I've ever written. I've probably written thousands of stories over 10 years of being a reporter, and nothing generated as much impact as this. And thankfully, it got the attention of the governor and the attorney general, who both condemned the practice, and Representative Athena Solomon, who has long been a champion of the rights of incarcerated people as far as their autonomy. And she's one of the main reasons why women in prison now are supposed to have free and unfettered access to feminine hygiene products. She brought that to the attention of the legislature, made it a big issue. She actually dropped a bill that would prohibit this practice in general. And so you can check that out on your own. I'll stop my screen share and just go back on me. So that story, since then, unfortunately, people will continue to reach out to me and let me know that they still think it's happening. They're still having problems. Women still reach out to me and say that they're not able to, receive feminine hygiene products. So I think of Sue Ellen. I'm sorry. There's a couple different women, but there was a formerly incarcerated woman who has passed away who told me that, Sue Ellen Allen, thank you. She told me that, Jimmy, the one thing that you have to learn is that the prisons were made for men, and women have kind of been shoehorned into them. And like everything was made with the consideration of a man in mind, because there didn't used to be as many people as we incarcerate in Arizona, as many women as we incarcerate in Arizona as there are now. And that has rang true to me for so long. Once she helped me understand that so many of the issues that women in prison face, I think, are because of these institutions were not made for women. Women have been moved from facility to facility. In recent years, they're finally put in the Perryville prison where they are now, and their numbers have continued to increase while overall incarcerations have decreased. So it's it's really troubling, because the problems that they face are specific to their gender, and we still don't seem to be able to tackle it. But I have been heartened by the appointment of the new director, Dr. Ryan Thornell, who comes from Maine. I haven't had an opportunity to sit down and talk with him yet. I think the administration wants to wait until he has been confirmed before they give press availability, because as we've seen, everybody who's been nominated for directorships has come under a lot of scrutiny. And while these folks deserve that scrutiny, I think there's a lot of political pressure right now to kind of lay low until they're in office. So I haven't had the opportunity to speak with him. However, I've been to a conference recently, talked to all kinds of people. When we found out it was Dr. Thornell, I called the ACLU of Maine, because that's just kind of, you hear about someone who runs these prisons, and my immediate thought is like, well, who has been their kind of adversarial counterpart? Like, who's been suing them? Who's the one really been looking for their flaws and their weaknesses and what's wrong with the way they operate their system? And the director of that ACLU, he basically said to me that they were sorry to see him go, that he had been, someone who had listened to their concerns about keeping people in isolation was one of the things that they've litigated with the Maine Department of Corrections over. Treatment of juveniles was another, but they told me that, Thornell is a person who's willing to listen. And then he's also been someone who has been a real champion of progressive programming, giving prisoners autonomy, trying to, treat them with empathy, with compassion, because he, I believe, knows that, that generates best results. So I think with the appointment of a new director, with the recognition of state leadership at the attorney general level and at the governor level, I think that maybe we're on a path where some of these things could be corrected. But, it's just going to take so much time and so much work to address these issues. And of course, another question it raises is, should we be incarcerating certain people at all? We have, thousands of nonviolent offenders in Arizona prisons right now, costing us, tens of millions of dollars every year that we could save if we were to just monitor them on home arrest or through another diversion program. And I especially think to myself, if someone's committed a nonviolent offense and they're pregnant, why are we sending them to prison? Does the punishment for whatever this crime was? I mean, so many people are in prison for like a financial crime, which obviously has victims. I have been the victim of identity theft. I've had money stolen from me, and I know how awful and terrible that is. But at the same time, you have to wonder, what is the value of putting a person in prison for something like that? How much is it going to cost us as society in terms of dollars and in terms of the responsibility we have to take on for incarcerating them? And I think this is especially true for pregnant people. What would be the harm if someone is charged and convicted of forgery or something, if we just allow them to remain with their family, have their child, and then if they must, go serve their time in a correctional institution? I think, maybe that could be an answer. Another unanswered question I have that, when I talk to people in other prisons in other states is, why is it so difficult to take care of the pregnant population in our prisons? As I wrote, the time of writing that story, there were 6 women in the Arizona prison system who were pregnant. And so, there is a infirmary at the Perryville prison. It would be an undertaking, but I don't think it would be a huge undertaking if we could just increase the capacity at that infirmary to have a place where if someone is nearing the end of their pregnancy, you could move them there. You could have the hospital and the people who work at the prison on standby to be able to, take them to the hospital to have their baby without these forced inductions. And the reason that we found that the prison is doing this policy, even though that they never admitted to doing it to this day, they still denied the practice, but I think it's pretty clear that it's happening, is that several years ago, attorneys from the prison law office and the ACLU, they toured Perryville and they talked to a woman who had given birth to a child in her cell. And, she was at the end. It was not like it was near the end of her pregnancy. It was not a surprise. Her water broke. She was banging on the doors, of her cell. All the women in cells around her were banging on the doors, asking for help. No one showed up, and the woman was forced to give birth, and she actually ended up giving birth to the child in the toilet of her cell. And luckily, the child was okay and lived. But apparently, after this incident, there was an informal policy where the prison said, we can't risk this liability anymore. We have to make sure that this isn't going to happen again. The press is too bad. The potential for lawsuits is too bad. So what they decided to do is that when a woman gets to about 36 or 37 weeks, they assign a time when they're going to induce the labor. They would tell the women this. The women, all of them would say, I don't want to do that. I'm uncomfortable with this. They, several of them had had children before. They had experienced induced labor before. And they talked about how it's a prolonged pregnancy. I'm sure if any of you all have experienced it, you could go on more about it than I ever could. But, from what I have learned, they told me that it's painful. It causes your labor to go on for a longer time than it would during a normal labor. It's just really uncomfortable for the woman. It's very stressful. And the big thing is it's just a loss of autonomy. We take away all the rights of incarcerated people. When they go into prison, they lose those rights in many instances long after they're in prison. But this most fundamental healthcare aspect, I think, is what was so troubling to them and so many other people, that we wouldn't give them the autonomy of just letting them have a natural birth when we are in a state that has devotes $1.5 billion every year to our prison system. Our healthcare contract is hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And, how are we at a place where we've got such a rudimentary answer to this problem? It just doesn't make any sense. And so, the women would say that, they'd protest and they would say, I don't want to do this. I'm against this. And they would be told, you don't have a choice. This is, this is going to happen. And so it just adds to the trauma. One thing that we didn't really get to talk much about in the story that all of them talked about was just the way that this added to the postpartum depression that they all experienced after their pregnancies. Because of Athena Solomon and other lawmakers who supported this legislation, the women in prison now are guaranteed, I believe it's 72 hours with their child after the birth. And, I mean, that's obviously a very short amount of time, but it's more than they had before. And they are apparently granted this time. But after that, the child is hopefully given to family members, if there are some, that arrangements can be made. And that did happen in each instance that I was able to document. But then when you're at the hospital, when you come back to the prison, in many instances, you're put in a quarantine. And as we learned during the COVID pandemic, still ongoing, obviously, but when we learned in the worst of the COVID pandemic, quarantine in Arizona prisons means an isolation cell. And so you have someone who went through this traumatic experience, was told you're going to have your baby early. I'm sorry, we didn't talk about that, but many times these women were induced before their due dates, which we know can be done safely in certain instances, and it's done sometimes when it's medically necessary if there are pre-existing conditions that might be a risk factor to the women, but it can also lead to complications. And so they've gone through that. Women and men are treated terribly when they're taken to the hospital when they're incarcerated. They are shackled. They are shackled during the transport, which most prisoners, are not during their day-to-day life. But they're, so it's a traumatic experience to be strip searched and shackled, taken to the hospital, forced to induce their labor. While they're at the hospital, of course, there's no contact with family. They deem it a security risk, so the father of your child cannot be alerted that this is happening, cannot attend the pregnancy because I believe, DOC thinks, or their argument is, well, we can't tell people when we're taking them to the hospital because you might arrange some elaborate escape plan or something. That's usually what's given. But so they were doing this alone. There's usually a guard in the room with them and outside the room, so a total stranger. And because of the failures of our prison healthcare system, healthcare workers, as wonderful people as they are, I can see how you would get frustrated dealing with the Department of Corrections because they are not good stewards of these patients. They're not good partners in administering healthcare, and they literally don't pay their bills. Our healthcare contractors have repeatedly over the years ended up owing the hospitals who are good enough to work with them millions of dollars. And I just reported that Horizon Health, which was 2 healthcare providers ago, they just went bankrupt. And one of the reasons was because they have tens and tens of millions of dollars of outstanding debts all over the country for stuff like this, for not paying the healthcare providers that they work with. So when a person incarcerated in a prison needs outside healthcare that can't be conducted inside the prison by the contractor, it's the responsibility of the contractor to then compensate the hospital for whatever that procedure was. So it comes out of their profit margin, out of their bottom line. So they're already inclined to not want to send people out for healthcare. I've reported on, people who have broken their leg. I just talked to a man the other day, a man who broke his leg because he slipped and fell getting off his top bunk. He had a compound spiral fracture. His leg is physically crooked. And it is to this day because they didn't want to send him out to the hospital because they didn't want to pay for it. So all that is just to say that if you're an incarcerated person, you get sent to the hospital, even if you have healthcare workers with the best of intentions, you're probably not getting the best treatment. You're going to some hospital that is taking your business for some reason. It may be a profit motive. Hopefully it's out of kindness and willingness to serve the public, but you're not going to get the same kind of treatment as you and I were. There's this stigma out there. Healthcare workers have also told me that during the pandemic, DOC officials refused to wear masks. They refused to abide by quarantine policies. They wouldn't wear the smocks. Guards repeatedly fall asleep while they're doing security at the hospitals. So, if you're coming in there with the DOC, you're not getting treated very well. When you're discharged, after you've had time with your child, you're sent back to the Department of Corrections and you're isolated. And you're isolated for probably a week. And it's in the depths of that isolation that these women said their postpartum depression is just really terrible. And there's a high rate of self-harm and suicide in Arizona prisons. And this is part of it. We're not we're keeping people in isolation. We're not tending to their healthcare and their medical needs. And it's just exacerbating all these problems. So all the women I talked to said they wanted everyone to know that, what is the stated purpose? I believe it is, just answering the Q&A, what is the stated purpose of that isolation? I believe it is because they're thinking you've been outside the prison, you've been at a hospital, you could potentially have been exposed to viruses or whatever infection. And so as you would when you're brought in from just anywhere into the prison, there is a period of time when you're kept by yourself. But I'm just saying that it kind of compounds the issue for these women. And they talked about wanting to end their lives. They're already thinking about I just was able to spend time with this beautiful child that I just birthed, and I'm not going to see them again for maybe several years in some instances. So it just compounds all that. So there's so many atrocities, so many things going wrong with Arizona prisons. But, this is the worst I've ever seen. And I think the public reaction to that shows that it really struck a chord with a lot of other people. So, I don't think the legislation that Representative Solomon sponsored is probably, I don't believe it got a hearing. So I don't think that so I don't think it's going to pass. It's yet to be seen whether the governor might take some sort of action, like an executive order or something. But I do think that, this is something that the new director, Dr. Thornell, is aware of and would probably, be looking into. So it's definitely a question I have for him, something I want to follow up with him on. And, hopefully we can make some progress there. But I think another answer just has to be diversion, keeping men and women out of prison as much as we can, especially if they've been convicted of a nonviolent offense where they, there's no other reason to separate them from society other than the punishment factor. I think we need to look at those options because as my other reporting has shown, we can't adequately staff our prisons. Whistleblowers come to me all the time. We profiled several of them from the Lewis prison recently who said that, they think the prison is on the brink of collapse. It's gotten so bad that most shifts are under 50% of what the official roster is supposed to be. And the roster has already been adjusted to reflect the low levels of corrections officers in Arizona. And that's just on the security side. The healthcare aspect of things is understaffed as well. The new healthcare provider, NAFCare, they just published a count of all of their employees that does show that they have increased hiring, but they're still not meeting the benchmarks that were set by the court. There's still a lot of prisons that don't have like a medical director. There's still a lot of prisons where there isn't a provider. Someone, they call it the provider level, is like a doctor, someone who can order things, who can send you off site if you need it. They're just not there. They're leaving a lot of work to nurse practitioners and lower level techs. So, the security side, the healthcare side, both of them drastically understaffed. We've seen through my reporting, the reporting of ABC 15, how the infrastructure in all of our prisons is in terrible shape and crumbling. I think many of us are probably familiar with the stories about the locks not working. I recently covered a trial where a man who was incarcerated at the Lewis prison accused the warden of having a hit put out on him and other people. And this was apparently because the prisoners were not abiding by the unspoken code of too many of them were opening their own cell doors and entering a common shared area when they shouldn't be. And that, the warden was getting mad at them because that makes them look bad. Because if you have one or two guys cruising around in the yard when they're not supposed to, that's not a big deal. But if you have like 5 or 6 of them, that clearly shows you that these people are letting themselves out of their cells. And so there were people who were asked to be enforcers. So like if you're an enforcer prisoner and you see other prisoners who are not abiding by this unspoken code, you're supposed to go out there and you're supposed to, physically attack them and threaten them and make sure that they're staying in their cell. And this man claims that he refused to do that. And therefore the warden put out a hit on him and tried to have him killed. There were 2 different incarcerated people who testified saying, yes, this warden told me to kill this man. And the jury ended up siding with the state, which is pretty common in civil trials where an incarcerated defendant is seeking damages. People are just inclined not to believe incarcerated people. This man's character was put on trial as well, and there were some questions, good questions that were brought up about things that he had done in the past that would make you question what he said. But I know after talking to a lot of people that were involved in that trial that this is definitely actually happening. That's my takeaway. That's my personal opinion. This is really happening. And so what we also learned in that case was that it's already common knowledge that gangs run our general population in our prison yards. These gangs are, racially, they're built on racial lines. And, this is just, if you talk to anyone who's been in prison, you don't have a choice. If you're a white person, you have to join like the white gang. If you're a different nationality, you're just automatically a part of that gang. But what we learned in this trial, this man was saying that there are units where you are taken, where if you were a gang member, you're put in this unit to take your power away and to keep you from organizing the other gang members. And within that unit, they had established a new gang, which crossed racial lines for the first time ever. And so it's just all these. I think someone said horrifying. It really is. I think if the average person could have sat in on a day of that trial or the healthcare trial, I just don't think people really truly get how bad it is, security-wise, infrastructure-wise, and healthcare-wise. And so, why is this important? It's because of the outcomes it's generating. We're certainly not rehabilitating anyone. I mean, the best we could hope for is that someone comes out the same as when they came in. But of course, that's not going to happen. I mean, that no one is going to leave an Arizona prison better than when they came in my opinion. So the best that we can hope for is that we have not traumatized them, mentally or physically scarred them to the point where, they can't be a productive member of society anymore. Most of these people are getting out. They're going to be our neighbors. They're going to be hopefully, working in our communities again. And we just give them so many obstacles for that to happen. And so, we need to be paying attention to these things. We need to be invested in the people who are trying to make things better. If the new director really is a change agent and a reformer, he's going to need people to defend him, because I think some people see that as, soft on crime or, soft on incarcerated people. But, the time in prison is the punishment. It shouldn't be, the conditions in the prison. I've reported on, the sanitary conditions, the food conditions, basically all the people who've ever worked in food service in the prisons. They say that, the Quonset huts where, from decades ago, where we take people to go to the chow hall, essentially, they're infested with rodents. You can hear the rodents scattering through the walls. The places where they prepare the food, warming trays, you open them up, roaches come spilling out of them. There's little to any oversight from the state as far as like food service inspections go, resulting in foodborne illness that occurs all the time. So, we're just harming people in every way possible. The water quality, I've reported on several prisons where water has been contaminated by wells, from nearby leaks, oil and other things getting into the water. So all this is to say that, the healthcare, the women in prison is what we're here to talk about today, but it's just it's a smaller part of a much larger systemic problem. That's going to end up affecting all of us because we're paying $1.5 billion a year as taxpayers for it. And, in my view, we're not getting anything out of it. We're making things worse. We're making things more expensive. And I think that's the argument that you can use and you can talk with to your friends, maybe who don't care. That's usually what I say to people. Like, I understand, maybe you don't know anyone who's been to prison, and maybe you're a crime victim and you have every right to feel bad about that, and you have every right to feel vengeful and sad about that. But if you want to live in a society where you're safe and you want to live in a society where your taxes aren't through the roof, we need to be invested, and we need to think about how our prisons are working and if they're working the way we want them to. And I would just finish up by saying, I think my reporting has shown that it's not.
There are a few questions that came up. Mark wants to know, what are most women in prison for in Arizona? Do you have information on that?
Not off the top of my head. I know it's a lot of nonviolent offenses, but I mean, just anecdotally, many women are in prison because of being involved with a partner. I don't know how many times I have, interviewed women who are in prison because their partner was involved in an illegal activity and therefore they become involved in an illegal activity. And, as many of us know, I mean, like your life partner has a big impact on your life, so if your boyfriend or your husband is running drugs or involved in an illicit activity, that happens quite a bit. And if it's just someone who you do share a child with, you're not necessarily going to want to separate yourself from them. I mean, that's a big one. I can also tell you that most of the women that I've spoken with over the years at Perryville have experienced domestic abuse and domestic violence. So, not talking about their charges, but as far as their life experiences go, that is a common factor, someone who's experienced sexual violence, domestic abuse, and then that continues when they're in the prison. This is something I'm working on now, but just anecdotally over the years, women have told me about how they are assaulted and raped by the people who work in the prisons. They just face challenge after challenge after challenge. But I can tell you that there aren't as many people in the Perryville who are at the higher custody levels as there are in the men's prisons, and that is usually because they haven't committed the same high level offenses that we're putting men in prison for.
Michelle has a question. What, if any, dent into lack of support do the prison doulas offer? I didn't know that the prisons had doulas.
I don't believe that they do have access to. I interviewed a doula for the healthcare story, and she told me that they have not had access to the prisons. So I could be wrong on that, but they need more access. Okay, Michelle says they used to. Okay. Yeah, I just went to a conference where we heard from people who were providing those services in the prisons and talking about how important it was, and they were able to advocate for them. So yeah, I do know that in recent years, they have not had access to the prisons. But from, what I have learned from interviewing doulas and talking to them about their work, like that would be a huge help if we could figure out a way to get them back in there. Maybe that's if that's someone areas of expertise, maybe that's something that you could bend the new director's ear about, because yeah, that experience or, that advocacy that they offer, because the doula that I talked to, she just talked about like, she felt like her main job was to just be an advocate and, someone who's there to support them throughout the whole process, no matter what they wanted. And that really is what they need the most. They don't have a family member there. They don't really have a doctor who cares about them. So, yeah, that would be something that if we could increase access to or bring it back, if it's gone away because of the pandemic, that would be huge.
John has a question too. He says, is there any mental health counseling or treatment in Arizona prisons?
Well, okay. So mental health counseling has been one of the things that has been historically understaffed as well. You can tell that they kind of, in the contracts, that's like a lower priority for them, because it's like, I think they think about like, what am I going to get sued for? And they know that they're going to get sued for, not treating severe injury or things like that, even though we have a bad track record on that too. But in my experience, it seems like they have made a lesser priority on healthcare workers. The people who do administer healthcare counseling are often corrections officers. These are higher level corrections officers who are trained in many ways and are professionals in many instances and really care about incarcerated people, but they are also not healthcare counselors. They're not addictions counselors, but what they will do is they will go through booklets with the prisoners on how to deal with trauma and anxiety. I had one person who I still communicate with who talks about how they do commit self-harm all the time. They've tried to take their own lives several times. And their counselor has on many times suggested that they listen to a podcast, about like dealing with their stress. Another thing I've reported on is the group therapy sessions that are offered to men in the different prisons. When you go to a group therapy session, you are put in it's a cage that looks like a phone booth. So if you can imagine a phone booth and that you can't get out of, you're shackled, you're put into that cage, and then you're in a room with like 6 or 7 other men in those cages, and you're having like a group therapy session. And men that I've talked to who have been in that say it's not helpful, because there are some people in there who are very seriously mentally ill. So you have people that are just spewing obscenities and saying hateful things to one another. So it's just not really a place for healing. The other thing that I've reported on extensively is these things called drive-by mental health encounters, where we just talked about how there aren't enough mental health counselors in the prisons. So therefore, the ones that they do hire have a huge caseload. So if I'm a mental health counselor, I've got to see 50 people today. I'm most likely going to go to their cell front and I'm going to say, hey, Jenkins, are you feeling okay? What's going on in there? And there'll be no response, because the person will be, curled up in a suicide smock in the corner, unresponsive to you. And so they'll put in a note like, everything's fine, no response, going to check back tomorrow. They're supposed to be taking people out of the cell, taking them to a secure location, a confidential location, which is provided, and having like a one-on-one therapy session with them. But oftentimes we have found through their own records that people will spend, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2-3 minutes at the cell front, having a one-way communication with the incarcerated person, and then moving on about their business and just documenting it. So, it's very rare that there's a meaningful therapy session like you or I might have been blessed to experience. And so, it's mental health counseling is not offered very much. And when it is, it's not offered in a way that could lead to any sort of, healing.
Diane has a question. Diane's actually one of our board members and our head of legal. And she says, if there is no staff and no medical care and the facilities are falling apart, what is all the money going for, in addition to private for-profit prisons?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is going to profit all the people that we contract with. If you look up their contracts, many of which I've posted in my reporting, but if you look them up on the state procurement website, they all have line items that just say profit, so the prison healthcare, generates tens of millions of dollars in profit for the operator every year. The phone and communication services, huge amounts of profit. There's actually, I think it's something like 75% of that money goes back to the Department of Corrections that they're able to use indiscriminately. And what we see is there'll be money appropriated for certain things, and then the Department of Corrections will go to the legislature and they'll say, hey, I know I was supposed to use this pot of money to help on prisoner programming and on prisoner rehabilitation, but we have inoperable fire systems, we have inoperable locking mechanisms. We need to reappropriate that money and put it into infrastructure. And so you'll see lots of times money that was supposed to be spent on rehabilitation is actually being reappropriated, cleared by the legislature, to be spent on things like making sure fire suppression systems work and making sure that like locks are replaced. So that has been my experience of when people say, where does the money go? It's profit, and it's being taken and put back into the crumbling infrastructure, which is just chasing after something that they're never going to be able to fix. It is good that they made the decision to shutter the Florence prison for the most part, but the answer to that was, I feel, inappropriate. What I reported on was they signed a contract that's going to generate $10 million a year in profit for a private prison company to house them at their facility, instead of moving the people in Florence to the other state facilities that we still have, which all have tons of bed space. That was one thing that happened with the pandemic for several reasons. Our prison population went down by almost 10,000, I think, from its peak. And so that has left us with a lot of space in our state-run facilities. But instead of utilizing that space more appropriately, we are moving people out of the state-run prisons, giving them over to the private prison companies, and we're losing money that way too, because it's generating profits for them. And it is just, they come right out and say it costs more to house people in a private prison than it does in the public prisons. So that's another place where the money's going.
There's another question here from David. Sorry, my dog, there's all kinds of activity outside. Are there any faith-based groups or organizations that are aware of and involved with addressing these deficiencies?
Faith-based groups. I don't know. I have talked to, there are a lot of people who go in as, what's the word? Not like a faith, it's the like a
chaplain.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there are individual chaplains who have a lot of access to the prisons and who go in and lead prayer groups and things like that. And actually, the recent execution of Frank Atwood generated litigation that allowed him to have his spiritual advisor come see him more. He was actually allowed to, the night before his execution, he was made a monk in his religion, which I believe is Greek Orthodox, if I'm not mistaken. And then for the first time in the history of Arizona, his spiritual advisor, I think his name was Father Paisios, he was able to be in the execution chamber. I witnessed this, and he was there with him. He laid a garment on him, and he laid his hand on top of that garment throughout the entire execution, and was there with him, praying with him. So I know that's not the question you asked, but the only thing I really know about is the chaplains and the increased access for spiritual advisors during executions.
And then there's another question here from Mark. If I remember correctly, there was an article in the New Times about how Department of Corrections took COVID relief money and used it to remodel their headquarter offices near the state capitol. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was true. That did happen. I reported on that too. Yes. They've used COVID money for all kinds of things. But that was, and then the thing that they remodeled with that COVID money, they're tearing that building down right now, and they already moved their offices to a separate building. So, not only was it a horrific waste of money, but the building's being torn down. And then also just incarceration. Excuse me, I'm struggling with a little bit of a illness. The money, a lot of the COVID funding was also used to reduce the amount it costs to jail people in our jails. So there is if you're arrested in Tempe for like a DUI, and the Tempe police officer brings you to the Maricopa County jail and they put you in jail, Tempe pays Maricopa County a per diem rate to have that incarcerated person in the county jail. And Maricopa County used COVID dollars to lower that rate so that cities could continue to incarcerate people in our jails during the pandemic at a rate that they could afford. So that's just another example of the ways that COVID money was used to increase incarceration.
Unbelievable, but totally believable because it's Arizona. And David says, my point being, we need to shame faith-based groups to quit focusing on drag queens and libraries and to focus on where the need is real. I couldn't agree with you more, David, but unfortunately, a lot of these Christians these days are really not trying to model themselves after the teachings of Christ. There was a really good, I don't know if anybody here, if you ever listen to the Moth Radio Hour on, I think it's Saturdays on NPR. You probably know the schedule better than I do. But there was a really great story that this guy told, and I don't remember what state he was in, but he was a corrections officer. And he started off his story by talking about how he was the biggest, baddest. Everybody was afraid of him. He could, make things happen. If something, if there was anything going on, like he was the heavy or whatever. And I can't remember exactly because it was one of those where I was like running errands. So I only heard pieces of the story, but he basically had a realization, like, this guy who he'd been leaning on ended up killing himself.
Hmm.
And, and he felt terrible because he knew that he was part of the reason why. And he said after that, it completely changed everything for him and his colleagues, and how that particular prison somewhere on the East Coast had a massive culture change. And they started saying please and thank you, and just like basic things that everybody should deserve,
Yeah.
and it was a really it was a good story. I recommend it. You can find it probably on KJZZ. And then the other thing I thought of that you just spoke about too, well, you talked about
can I add on to what you said there?
Sure.
I don't know if anybody saw this, but I just did a story about how Khalil Rushdan was just appointed to the Maricopa County Commission on Trial Court Appointments. And Khalil is, I think, a lot of people might know him, but he was formerly incarcerated, wrongly convicted, and he was exonerated by the Justice Project in like 2012 and released. And so he does a lot of work in this space. And when we were talking, he said he has been talking with the incoming administration and the new director, and he said what he's told them and other people in the past is if you want to help, if you want to change the culture, he said start putting fresh tomatoes on the salads. And everybody said, well, like, what are you talking about? And he goes, there's never any like fresh fruits or vegetables served to us in the prison. So he said, so if you and the one reason is that they claim, and people do this, but they claim that people use fruits and vegetables to make hooch, like they make alcohol with it inside. But he said if you just do something as simple as just put some tomatoes on the salads, he goes, you'd have less fights, people would be less upset, there'd be, he said it would go such a long way. And then like that's what you just said, like his example of if you just treated people with a little kindness, a little consideration, just did something to make them feel like a human being, it would like exponentially, go like a long way to make things better.
Oops. I know that you're here today to talk, about the pregnancy and that the induced births and things like that, but you have done quite a bit of work about executions. And I guess I don't, are you optimistic? Because again, on these Fridays, we often it's a depressing topic. They're very frequently depressing topics. And so, with Dr. Thornell, I'm already inspired by the fact that he's now, I think he said something about instead of referring to them as inmates, he's calling them residents now. So that makes me feel good. Do you feel, and I think wasn't there a pause in executions while Chris Mays?
Yeah, right.
So what are your thoughts going forward in Arizona with executions?
Okay. Yes, there has been a pause. And just today, I just reported that the judge I referenced earlier, Judge David Duncan, that he's been made the commissioner to review the death penalty in Arizona. And this is incredible because there's a lot of judges that know Arizona prisons, but he knows them really well. There's an anecdote I like to talk about where he went and visited people in the prisons during the healthcare trial to see what was going on, or during the healthcare oversight. And he wears hearing aids, and he was in a healthcare unit, and he was sweating so bad that his hearing aids malfunctioned and stopped working. And to him, that was like, it was just like he was telling the court, he's like, my hearing aids stopped working because I was sweating so much. While he was incensed over this. It's just one example, but like he's been there, he's been on the ground, so he has a lot of empathy. This is another man who he thanks incarcerated people for coming into his court and testifying. I've seen this. He will turn to them and he'd say like, I know this was a long experience for you. I thank you for being here. I appreciate your perspective. So huge amounts of empathy, huge amounts of experience. Just his character is just, beyond reproach. Just amazing person. But he's in charge of reviewing the death penalty process. And that happened because Governor Hobbs she's issued an executive order creating this commissioner position. And so he will now be charged with looking into the execution process. And he's not been charged with like, should we do away with the death penalty? And he made that clear, and Governor Hobbs made that clear. His job is to investigate the lack of transparency, the methods, the way we're carrying it out. He told me that he's going to start by working with the attorneys who have filed complaints in the federal courts about the execution process. And those are the folks that we want him listening to, in my opinion, because they're the ones who, they know exactly what's going wrong. They're the experts. And so, he's going to be looking into things like, where are the drugs coming from? How much have they cost? How are we storing them? During the executions of Dixon and Atwood, there was a lot of questions about the shelf life of the drug. And all three of these men were supposed to be executed in 2021, but because of the work of their attorneys, we found out that the shelf life of the compounded pentobarbital they use, which is like, they mix a powder with water or something and they turn it into an injectable form, that shelf life was less than half the time that DOC had been telling everyone it was. So you see these botched executions going on around the country. Part of the reason for that could be expired drugs. So he's going to be looking into things like that. At the same time, Attorney General Mays rescinded the request for a warrant of execution for Aaron Gunches, who is a man who had asked to be executed on death row, but he read our reporting in the Republic and he wrote back to the Supreme Court and he said, hey, you know what? I didn't realize that this was so problematic and the process was so problematic. I don't want to be executed anymore until they figure this out. So acknowledging that and acknowledging the problems. Oh, this is the other thing we didn't talk about, but in the execution that I watched and in the other two executions, they haven't even been able to administer the execution drugs properly. So in the execution I watched, Frank Atwood, they put the first line in his left arm after a lot of poking and prodding. But then in the right arm, they couldn't find the vein. And so they said, we're going to cut into your femoral vein. And that can be a painful and uncomfortable process. They did it to Clarence Dixon. He grimaced and was saying, ow, that hurts. There was a AP reporter who commented that there was a fair amount of blood that happened during that process. So Atwood said to the executioners, what's the problem? Like, I do blood work all the time in here. I'm an old man. They take my blood all the time. I have to get infusions and yada, yada. So he suggested that they try several different locations, one of which was on his hand. And so he directed them to do the execution. So the way we do it is problematic. They're going to be looking into, what is the problem behind that? My reporting has shown that it's because there's no training for the people who carry out the executions. But anyway, Attorney General Mays cited all that and said, we're going to rescind Gunch's warrant, and we're going to pause until Governor Hobbs's commissioner completes the report, which is due this fall. So if I had to guess, Arizona is not going to execute anyone this year, at least. But, we don't know. I mean, like I said, the report is not, should we do a death penalty anymore? The report is, why are we screwing it up so bad? What is really happening? And what can we do to improve the process? So, it's unclear what might happen in 2024.
Yeah, I remember reading your reporting about that, where he essentially administered his own,
right.
execution.
He told them how to do it.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Michelle asks, and I know we're really close to time, so I want to honor everybody's time, but she asks, have you seen any comparison with other states and changes that other states have made in pregnancies for inmates?
I talked to some people at a conference I just went to in Austin about what they did, and it's basically what I just described. They have units in their infirmary for people who are near term or near the end of their pregnancy. So I think that's the common sense answer, is just to have a place where if you're 37 weeks or 36 weeks or whatever, you just go live in the infirmary and you're kind of on standby for a little while. And it's not more expensive to do that. It's just a matter of bed space, probably. And then that is a problem. So they would have to increase the size of the infirmary. But, I don't know, what would it cost, like $50,000 or $100,000 to remodel the building and put a few extra beds in there? I think would go a long way. So that is the best case, or that's the best answer I heard from my colleagues and people that work in other states.
Yeah, Diane just pointed out, and I was just gonna say this, Diane. She says, I visited a women's prison in Belarus in 1998, and for God's sakes, they had an entire ward for mothers and babies who lived there till the baby was 3. I mean, other countries
do
this.
Yeah.
Those kids are already going to be traumatized anyway. And so we know that birth to 3 is so important. Why wouldn't we want to have that child set up for the most success in their life?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, what's the most recent medical experts saying about breastfeeding too? I mean, it's at least several years if you can do it, right? I mean, I have friends who've done it until age 4 or 5 of their children. And we know that studies show that, so, that's all out the window. That's not happening. So yes, I mean, having a devoted unit for it, I think would be huge. And another thing, there was a man who ran the Colorado prison system who was actually, I think, a candidate for our prison system. And he's a huge fan of Thornell. But when he was in Colorado, he allowed the women to, in one instance, to run their own dorm. They set up rules, the regulations, how to operate, how to feed themselves. He gave them the autonomy, to run their system. And these were, I think, nonviolent women who were able to do this. But it's just one example of the kind of programming that is possible. And he got huge results. And the 2 of them zoomed in while we were witnessing his presentation, and they're doing great. And they all just talked about how important it was for them to be trusted and for them to be treated like human beings, and how beneficial it was to them.
Well, I just appreciate all the writing that you do. I mean, it is really, I don't, knock wood, it's just award-winning writing. It's so good. It was so comprehensive. I think it should be required reading, really. It was so in-depth in so many different areas. Everybody should read about what's going on in our prisons, because I don't care what you've done. People should not be treated the way that you've described in your series of articles. So thank you so much. What's something that gives you hope with the weekend coming up?
Well, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of David Duncan. And so I'm so thrilled that he's the commissioner of this death penalty thing. I mean, just you out there as a citizen, you couldn't ask for a better person to be in charge of this. And, I'm hopeful that, we're seeing more stories like Khalil Rushdan being put in places of power where he can impact who's going to be a judge. And I'm hopeful that, the new prisons director is someone who comes from a place of knowing that programming is important. And I'm hopeful just knowing that I'm getting answers from the governor and the attorney general about these issues, when in the past 7 or 8 years I've reported on them, I haven't. So I think we've gotten to a point in Arizona where we have incarcerated so many people that it just can't be ignored anymore. There's more and more people, you'll hear about a conservative lawmaker or Republican who, are generally not aligned with prison reform as a high priority. And you'll hear about them being involved, and you'll come to find out that it's because they know someone who's incarcerated, So yeah. I think that we are at a point where we could be really maybe starting to move in a direction that's more empathetic and more based on outcomes and results, and more based on saving money and returning people to society in a better place.
Yeah, don't expect it from the Freedom Caucus, but it is starting to happen.
No comment.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody else for attending, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. It's an honor to be here. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And thank you for supporting my work. It means so much. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Everybody subscribe to Arizona Republic and have a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Thanks.